Hi everyone. This last week we had a holiday, Veterans Day, a day to honor the people that have served our country. And in thinking about that, I was thinking about in the Bible, was there any veterans? And the person that came to my mind was a young man named David. So if we have our Bibles, we're going to go to the book of 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel chapter 17. And we see God working with this man. And later on, we see him going through many, many battles and being king of Israel. But this is earlier on in his life. And I want to look at how God works with him. 1 Samuel chapter 17. Now the Philistines had been warring with Israel. And they were on either side of this valley, and they would line up together and just stare each other down, seeing who was the strongest. And there was a warrior, this strong man. His name was Goliath, on the side of the Philistines. And we catch up in this story in verse 4. So 1 Samuel 17, verse 4. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath, from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. This Goliath, this man was tall. He was 6 cubits and a span, which is 9'9". Okay? That's a little bit taller than me. A lot of bit taller than me. And he stood out there and challenged the people of Israel to send one other person against them. Let's find out a little bit more about this guy named Goliath. Verse 5, he had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze, or 125 pounds. This chainmail that he wore was 125 pounds. And then it says in verse 6, and he had bronze armor on his legs and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, or 15 pounds it weighed. And the shield bearer went before him. This guy was a beast, 9'9" tall, just this warrior. In verse 8 it says, he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. And if he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man, that we may fight together. Now, he's challenging them, not to just go to battle and have senseless bloodshed, but have two duke it out in a giant game of thumb war or an arm wrestling match, but the stakes were life. And he's challenging them, basically saying, hey, you're this people of Israel. Aren't you supposed to be under God? Isn't he supposed to fight for you? So come and try me. And no one did. We see verse 11, when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now, do we have these moments in our life? Do we have these moments when we've got something challenging us so much and we're greatly afraid? And I think we do. We have these things in our life, and so what do? We run. Verse 12, now we have this other person, this David, coming onto the scene. And David was the youngest of his family, and his older brothers were off to war. and his father sent him to send supplies, send some cheese, send some bread, send some things there to the brothers that were at this battle. And so David comes on the scene, and as he comes to the to where the camp is, he sees them going out and lining up to fight. And verse 21 is when we're going to pick this up. For this, it says here, for Israel and the Philistines had drawn up to battle array. They were lined up, army against army. And so David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper and ran to the army and came to greet his brothers. And as he talked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines. And he spoke according to the same words, so David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, they fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. They ran. And David's sitting there watching them run. In verse 25, so the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come to defy Israel. It shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich him with great riches and will give him his daughter and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. You see, King Saul has said, hey, I'm not brave enough to fight. Anyone who does this, I'm going to give my daughter as a wife, and your family won't have to pay taxes anymore. That should have been incentive, right? But no one had. They were too afraid. And so David is hearing all of this. We get to verse 26. Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? You see, did David have a different perspective here? David did. He saw that this man, this Philistine, this Goliath, was defying God, mocking God. And so he says, who is this guy compared to God? God's living. And so as he's talking about this, someone else hears about this. We go on and read verse 27. And the people answered him in this manner, saying, so it shall be done for the man who kills him. Now Eliab, his older brother, who heard this when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David, and said, why did you come down here? With whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and innocence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. You see, David's brother thought he just came to watch the spectacle, and he was angry. Verse 29, and David said, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? Then he turned from him toward another and said the same thing. And these people answered him as the first ones did. Now catch this. Verse 31, now the words which David spoke were heard, and they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. These words that David is speaking of faith, Saul heard through the grapevine. And so he sent for him. Then David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. David said, hey, this guy has got to be stopped. He's mocking God, and it can go on no longer. So Saul said to David, are you not able to go, or you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him? For you are our youth, and he a man of war from his youth. Saul says to David, hey, you're this young guy. How are you going to do this? You're but a youth. You've just been out in there watching your father's sheep. And this guy, he's been fighting since he was a teenager. How is this going to work? A lot is on the line. But notice what David says here. Verse 34, "But David said to Saul, 'Your servant used to keep his father's sheep. And when a lion or a bear came and took the lamb out of the flock, I went after it and struck it and delivered the lamb out of the sorry, I lost my place. Your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took the lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard,'" here, "and struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God." Now David here, now notice this. Why did David think he could go against Goliath? He realized that God had been with him in the past. Whenever a lamb or a sheep was taken by a lion or a bear, he went out after it, right? And did he have victory there? Right? God gave him the victory there, saved the sheep or the lamb, and saved David and gave him the victory over these animals. Now, if God can do that with David just to save a sheep, why wouldn't God do it for his people? And this is what's going through David's mind, I believe, is God is here. He's been with me through the past, all these other times. Why is this any different? And so he says to Saul, I can do this because God's worked with me in the past. And so he says that this Philistine has defied the armies of God. Verse 37, moreover, David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And so what did Saul have to argue? He wasn't going to go himself, so he says, "Go, and the Lord be with you." So then catch this next part here, verse 38. So Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put on a bronze helmet on his head, and he also clothed him with a coat of mail. And David fastened his sword to his armor, and he tried to walk, for he had not tested them. You see, Saul wanted to give him every advantage, human advantage. And so David puts on the same thing that Goliath has. The mail, the protective gear, the armor, the helmet, the sword, all these same things. And then he says, I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them. So David took them off. All the human bits of protection he took off. Now next week I'm going to be preaching a sermon connected to this concept. So tune in again and listen to that. It'll be the part 2. So he said, no, I haven't tested these, and he took them off. Then he took, verse 40, he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook. And he put them into his shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had, and his sling which he had in his hand. Now this wasn't like a slingshot as you think of as when you're a kid. This is a different kind of sling. And he drew near to the Philistine. So he goes out. No one stops him. He goes out with what he has already proven with God. Verse 41, so the Philistine came and began drawing near to David. And the man who bore his shield went out before him. Notice that someone else was leading him there. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him. He mocked him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good-looking. Here's this good-looking kid coming out to this warrior. He thought it was a joke. Verse 43, so the Philistines said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? Now notice something here. Some people think he had double vision because he says sticks. How many sticks did David have? He had one. The Philistine cursed him, David, by his gods. And the Philistines said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. He's mocking him, talking smack. Then David said to the Philistine, let me stop there for a second. Now, if per se, that this giant had, some people think he had suffered from giantism, and one of the side effects was double vision. And so if he can't see very well, he has to be led out there by his armor bearer or his sword bearer or shield bearer just to see where things are. He's just a straw man. He's just this giant figure to intimidate. And so he just intimidates with his words. Humanity does the same thing. And sometimes we do too. We intimidate others with our words when there's nothing behind them. And this is what's happening. And he's not only doing that, but mocking God. Now verse 45, then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. He didn't say, hey, I'm coming to you with this sling and the stones. He says, I'm coming with God. Verse 46, this day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. Take it off. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Wow. He upped the ante, didn't he? Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will deliver you into our hands. He's telling him that the battle is not won with sword and shield, but God wins the battle. So it was when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. This is where we got to go with our giants towards them. Then David put his hand into his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead. Now, you may think that this sling is something, not just a toy. But this was something that they used in warfare. And so David was coming at him with unconventional warfare, something different than Goliath was used to fighting. And they say if he would have come with a sword and shield, he would have died. But he used something different, had to think outside the box, and he throws that rock with the sling. The slingers could throw rocks upwards to 1,300 feet, 1,300 feet. They could throw rocks that far, farther than the archers could throw with the arrows. And this is what he did. He threw that rock and it hit him in the forehead so hard that it sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with the sling and stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. And there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. This is what happens. They're killed by their own sword. And this is what the giants in our life, that's what will happen to them too. If we but have faith in God, and stick to his promises like David did. David realized that God has been with him in the past. And you know what? For us now, God is going to be with us in the future, knowing that he's been with us in the past. And so if you look at the giants in your life, you may say they're so big, so strong, I can't. But with God, you can. If we read in Hebrews 13, verse 6, it says, "So we may boldly say, 'The Lord is my helper. I will not fear.'" He's our helper. He'll get us through. Pray with me. Dear God, I want to thank you for life. Thank you for the gift of your Son, and thank you for giving us the victory, because you've already won. Help us not to forget that. In your name, amen. Join me next week as we go to part 2 and look at a different aspect of this same story, or something related to it. Have a blessed week.